Hello, I'm Stephen McInerney, Academic Director and Deputy CEO at the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. Welcome to the Ramsay Centre Online, our series of lectures and interviews, where we hear from prominent international and local speakers from all walks of life, including the arts, politics, universities and business. One of the themes we've explored in this series over the years with speakers like Greg Sheridan, Rod Dreher and Rachel Fulton Brown is the role of religion in the West. And to continue to explore this theme, I'm joined today by Tom Holland, author of Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, which argues for the central place of Christianity in the formation of Western values. As Tom Holland writes, even the increasing numbers in the West today who have abandoned the faith of their forebears and dismiss all religion as pointless superstition remain recognisably its heirs. Christianity's enduring impact is not confined to churches. It can be seen everywhere in the West, in science, secularism, in gay rights, even in atheism. Tom Holland, welcome. It's nice to
Hi there.
nice to see you, and I hope we can have you actually in Australia in the future now that our borders are reopening and things are starting to move again. That would be terrific.
Not in time for the Ashes, I fear. Though looking at our prospects, I think that's maybe a good thing. But
maybe
one day, I hope.
Perhaps not even the whole English team is coming out, I believe. At least not the best.
At one point, I was hopeful of being selected myself, but they managed to find out, I think.
In the introduction to Dominion, you write that the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization has been so profound that it has come to be hidden from view. Before we get to the influence of Christianity on the making of the Western mind, tell us, if you would, what prompted you to write about it, to bring its influence out of hiding, as it were. You mentioned, for example, that you ceased believing in God at an early age. So I'm wondering, did you surprise yourself writing this book?
Yeah, well, I think people are unsurprised when, I don't know, novelists or poets say that maybe the roots of a book lies in their childhood. But the same can absolutely be true of people writing nonfiction, and that was definitely the case with the impulses that led me to write Dominion. This is a book absolutely rooted in my own upbringing, and I was raised in the Church of England by a very devout mother who provided a kind of, a moral model for me. So there was never a question that I rejected institutional religion in a kind of, I don't know, Byronic manner, shaking my fist at God. It was never like that. And in fact, I was fascinated by Christianity, by the Bible. I loved the stories. But kind of the interest in that went hand in glove with a kind of, I suppose in the Bible, the stories are all about the weak triumphing over the strong. Or so if you think of the children of Israel escaping Pharaoh, or David killing Goliath, or of course, most obviously, the resurrection, I suppose. But as a child, I was obsessed by dinosaurs. And in my dinosaur books, there were always terrifying predators, savaging, large herbivores. And that interest in very fierce, very glamorous, very extinct things seamlessly moved forward into a fascination with the world of the classical civilizations, Greece and particularly Rome. And Rome was kind of absolutely the apex predator. It was the kind of the tyrannosaur of the ancient world. And I just kind of found it more glamorous. And to be honest, if you'd asked me when I was 10, whose side was I on, Pontius Pilate's or Jesus, I would have said, I'm ashamed to say Pontius Pilate's. He had the soldiers, he had the armor, he had the togas, all that kind of stuff. I just found it much more interesting. And to be honest, the kind of, I think that those kind of intellectual fascinations that are also kind of dyed in an emotional response that you have in childhood can be incredibly influential on your subsequent interests. So as an adult, I came to write about the classical world. I wrote about Greece, I wrote about Rome. But writing about them for years at a time, trying to get into the minds of people like Julius Caesar, who slaughtered 1 million Gauls, Leonidas, who heroically defended the pass at Thermopylae, but was king of a state that was founded on slavery. I increasingly came to find these people are unbelievably alien to me. Sure, you can be interested in a Tyrannosaur, but you don't want one as a pet. And likewise, you can be fascinated by these ancient civilizations, but you can absolutely come to recognize that you would not have wanted to live in them in any way. And so the more I thought about this, the more I came to say, well, what has changed? What is the process by which these very, very alien worlds were utterly transformed? And I came to the conclusion that what changed was Christianity, and that almost everything that I took for granted, almost everything my friends took for granted, almost everything that the society I live in takes for granted, is so shaped by Christianity that we don't even notice it. That we are, as I kind of say in the book, I think that we are goldfish swimming in Christian waters. And really, I wrote Dominion to kind of stress test that thesis to see if it stood up. And I'm very happy to announce that, in my opinion, it did stand up, because otherwise I wouldn't have published the book.
And then central to that, your identification with a set of values that you don't recognize in the ancient world is this event, the Crucifixion, which takes place in the ancient world and is the catalyst for the transformation of that world. You include an image in your book of the Passion, an ivory carving that's held in the British Museum. One of the earliest depictions of the Passion, but it was produced when the Christian faith was already more than 400 years old. So why did it take Christians so long to depict and venerate this image, which is obviously so central to Christian faith, so ubiquitous in Western art and culture? What does it tell us about crucifixion in the ancient world and about the development of Christianity in its early centuries, that it took so long for Christians, as it were, to unashamedly own depictions of this image? And why then, centuries later, do we find some Christians pulling down a cross and burying it from view during the Reformation?
I think they felt embarrassed by it. I think there was a kind of lingering embarrassment about what the cross represented, because and this is a kind of classic example of the way in which we've become so saturated by Christian assumptions that it can be very difficult to see it as it originally was. For the Romans, the cross was a symbol of their right to essentially torture to death anyone who opposed them, and it was seen paradigmatically as the punishment that you inflict on slaves, because it was excruciatingly painful. There's one of the two pieces of physical evidence for crucifixion that survived is a fragment of bone found in a tomb outside Jerusalem, and you can see the nail through the bone. So you can imagine, and you have to haul yourself up and down to stop yourself from suffocating. Absolutely agonizing. It could be very protracted. It could go on for hours. It could go on for days. But above all, it was public. So your sufferings would become a kind of a spectacle for people who would gather and watch as birds pecked out your eyes, and you kind of, you hauled your bleeding, sweating body up and down. Just excruciating. And so the body of a rebel against his master, or a provincial a rebel against Roman power, nailed onto a cross, is serving as a kind of billboard for power. And that is what's so radical about what Christianity does, because it transforms this symbol of imperial power into the absolute opposite, a symbol of the power that the powerlessness has over the powerful. It's the kind of core paradox. And you've said that the crucifixion lies at the heart of Christianity. Of course, actually, it's the resurrection that lies at the heart of Christianity. And a number of Christians have said to me, well, you overemphasize the cross. Of course, I mean, it's the fact that this guy who is crucified then rises in glory from the dead that gives the cross its symbol. But that's not the resurrection is not a fact of history. We're kind of going into dimensions of theology there. But the crucifixion, pretty much every historian accepts that someone called Jesus was crucified. And I think that the core piece of evidence for that is that we have very, very early texts bearing witness to that, namely the letters of Paul. And what you get in Paul is he says that he is preaching Christ crucified. He is saying that this man who suffered this terrible death is in some way a part of the one creator God who fashioned the entire cosmos. He says this is basically, to the Jews, it's a stumbling block, and everyone will understand why it's a stumbling block. But he says, that it's likely to seem insane, it's lunacy, it's madness to the Gentiles, to the Romans, because Paul understands just how mad, just how kind of disgusting this idea is. It's not the idea that a man can become a god that is shocking to the Romans, because they're absolutely au fait with that. Julius Caesar becomes a god. Augustus, whose cult is probably the fastest growing in the Roman world in the lifetime of Jesus, becomes a god. He sits at the right hand of Julius Caesar, his divine father. He's brought in a reign of peace. This is the good news, the euangelion, the gospel that is proclaimed across the empire. So in a sense, what Paul is preaching is a kind of parody of that. And although, of course, he believes in it, nevertheless, he recognizes that it's shocking. And I think that sense hangs over Christians throughout the early centuries of the church, even in, as you say, even a century after the conversion of Constantine, who, of course, saw a cross, supposedly. That's what brings him to become a Christian. And when finally, you mentioned this ivory in the British Museum, Jesus does not look on that. Jesus does not look like a man who is suffering an agonizing death. To be honest, he looks. He looks like a contestant on Love Island or something. Yeah. I mean, he looks like he's kind of on a beach, Bondi Beach or whatever. He's very buff. He's very ripped. He's and actually, what he is, he's an athlete. He's wearing the kind of loincloth of an athlete who competes in the games, and he's he is an athlete who has triumphed over death. So that's how he's portrayed, and it's not for another 600 years until just before the millennium. There's a cross that shows Jesus dead, and that is in Cologne Cathedral, carved about, I think, 980. And from that point on, throughout the Latin Middle Ages, there's absolutely no inhibition about portraying the sufferings of Christ, both physically and in terms of meditations, reflections. And really that process throughout the Middle Ages, I think, ends up kind of oddly desensitizing us to it. We come to take it for granted. But to get a sense of just how scandalous the cross was, we need to think ourselves back into the shoes of people for whom it really was, kind of incomprehensible.
It is then, it becomes scandalous in a different way than when it is itself used as an instrument of power, does it not? So you mentioned Constantinian Revolution.
That is the great paradox. Yeah.
Mm.
Yes.
And go ahead.
Well, so the paradox is, we already had the paradox that an emblem of power becomes an emblem of the power of the powerlessness. But the further paradox is that this way of understanding the world then becomes so hegemonic that the cross itself becomes an emblem of power. Christianity is the single most hegemonic way of understanding what humanity's relationship to the cosmos might be that has ever existed. And it's been spread by missionaries, but it has also been spread at the point of a sword. And Charlemagne, the great Frankish king, who is crowned as emperor in Rome in AD 800 on Christmas Day, he is so infuriated by the refusal of the Saxons to convert to Christianity that he kind of inflicts it with mass killings, burnings, whatever. And his advisor, who's an English monk called Alcuin, kind of prides the shoulder and goes, "Whoa, steady on. We shouldn't be doing it like this. This isn't what Christianity is about." I paraphrase there. And there you have what has been a kind of abiding tension within the spirit of Christian imperialism ever since. So it's there in the Crusades, it's there in the Conquistadors, it's there actually in kind of contemporary Western anxieties about the nature of the West's own power. That what is really distinctive about Latin European imperialism, Western imperialism, is both how incredibly effective and successful it's been, but also how very, very ambivalent the West has been about its own power. And I think that that's really, really distinctive. And I think that it reflects this great kind of snarl of ambivalences and ambiguities that are concentrated in the image of the cross.
Yeah, the theologian David Bentley Hart has said recently that what ultimately destroyed Christendom was Christianity, that somehow there's a dialectic going on between Christianity and the thing that it inspires, but is nonetheless logically distinct from Christendom or Christian empire. And that, and in some ways, as I think you're getting at, this is part of the Western capacity for self-critique, that somehow that derives not only from the Greeks, but in a different, very different way from Christianity.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. So I think that the paradox is that, as David Bentley Hart suggests, that the idea of Christendom itself comes to seem oppressive. The power of Christianity, the authority, the sense that the church has become the kind of institution that might nail people to crosses, and if not to crosses, then might kind of burn heretics or persecute Jews or persecute Muslims or whatever. Is in the long run, it leads to a kind of suspicion of the power that the church has come to have. And so the paradox is that people in the West kind of turn against Christianity, but for deeply, deeply Christian reasons. And I think that it would be naive to kind of pretend that the history of Christianity has been entirely that of people identifying with victims. I mean, I end the book with the most recent kind of episode was the migration crisis in Europe, when Angela Merkel famously let 1 million people from principally Muslim backgrounds into Germany. And it's pretty clear where the impulse for that came from. I mean, she's a politician, of course, so she did it for political reasons. But she does have a kind of clearly a moral core, a Lutheran core that comes from her upbringing as the daughter of a pastor who was known as, he was so committed to the idea that the suffering, the weak, the poor should have have value, that he, at the end of the war, kind of very unusually went from West Germany to East Germany to ensure that there'd be a Christian presence in what was going to become communist Germany. And so she was, and his past, where he lived was a center for looking after those who were physically disabled or whatever. So she grew up with that. So the parable of the Good Samaritan absolutely hardwired into her mind, and that her allowing 1 million people from a very different religious background, civilizational background, people who lots of Germans viewed with deep suspicion and hostility, her willingness to do that was kind of the parable of the Good Samaritan in action. But equally, there was another equally Christian approach, which was that embodied by Viktor Orban, who was taking the opposite route, saying, no, we're going to put up the fences, we're going to put up the barbed wire, we're not going to let these guys in, because these are dangers to Christian civilization. And he spoke as the leader of a country that had been occupied by the Muslim Ottomans for many centuries. And that sense that you should fight to defend Christianity, because if you don't, there won't be any Christianity, it has equally been a part of Christian history. And so there you have, in the figures of Merkel and Orban, you have, again, this, keep talking about paradoxes, but this kind of paradoxical tension at the heart of Christianity. Should you turn the other cheek? Should you love your enemies? Should you pick up, the injured Jew if you're a Samaritan and take him to an inn and pay for him to be looked after? Or should you fight to defend Christianity from its enemies? And that's been a kind of enduring dialogue again throughout Christian history. And I think it's very much, part of a dialogue that continues into the present day.
I want to come back in a moment to some other tensions, but before I do that, you mentioned before that famous passage, I preach Christ crucified, in St. Paul, a scandal to the Jews, and as you say, insanity to the Gentiles. A scandal to the Jews, and yet, of course, Christianity obviously arises out of Judaism. At the same time as its spread around the world is unimaginable outside the context of the Roman Empire. How did the distinctiveness of the Jewish nation in the Roman Empire, a people set apart, ruled and loved by a jealous God, come to be the origin of a faith that proclaimed that there was neither Greek nor Jew? And how is it that a convicted criminal came to be seen, you mentioned before, as part of the identity of the one God of Israel?
Well, so in that question, you used the word Judaism. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write Dominion was a kind of increasing recognition that so many words in English were so shot through with Christian assumptions that it was almost impossible to kind of to wash English of a kind of implicit Christian bias. So Judaism is a classic example of that. There was no such thing as Judaism in the lifetime of Jesus. There was a Greek word, an unusual Greek word, Judaismos, which is often translated as Judaism, but should more properly be translated as Jewishness, the kind of the quality of it, not even perhaps of being Jewish, the quality of being a Judean, because the Judeans, as the Romans thought of them, were a people. That's how the Romans saw them, and of course, it's how the Judeans themselves saw themselves. And the process by which Judeans became Jews is one that parallels the emergence of Christianity. So let's call it Jewishness, even as aware that there's a kind of measure of anachronism even in using that word. Jewishness in the lifetime of Jesus, I think, is best thought of as a kind of bandwidth. And that bandwidth is structured by the fact that the God worshipped by the people of Judea, the Judeans, let's call them the Jews, is simultaneously the God of Israel, a God who has chosen Israel as his personal, his chosen people. And he's the God who's created everything, created every human being on the face of the planet, created the entire earth, created the entire cosmos. So which aspect of that do you choose to emphasize? And essentially, in the lifetime of Jesus, there are people who embody both ends of the spectrum. Those who emphasize the quality of God as the God of Israel tend, and I exaggerate, I'm simplifying massively, but tend to be more focused in the Holy Land itself. Those who don't tend to be focused in the great cosmopolitan cities, Alexandria most notably, but Rome as well. So it's perfectly possible to worship the God of Israel and to be a kind of loyal citizen of the Roman Empire as well. And what ends up happening is that those in Judea kind of rise up against Rome, and this really kind of shatters that modus vivendi, and Judeans are kind of set on the process by which they become Jews. At the same time, what is happening in Christianity is basically that Paul, and those like him, come to emphasize the God who's created the entire world rather than the God of Israel. That doesn't mean that God's close personal relationship with the people of Israel has gone. It doesn't. It remains. But there is a new covenant, and in that new covenant, there is no Jew or Greek, and that essentially is the sets in train. You think of Jewishness as a kind of great river. It starts to bifurcate in the first century. And that process of bifurcation is one that takes a long time. It maybe 3 or 4 centuries, but it ends up with two ways of understanding the legacy of the Hebrew Scriptures. One which Christians have come to call Christianismos, Christianity, and another which Christians call Judaismos, which I think we could call Judaism, because what Christians are doing is that they are seeing those Jews who did not, as Paul did, accept Christ as Savior, as belonging to something that is a kind of parallel to Christianity. And so they construct something called Judaism, which from the 2nd century onwards exists as a kind of shadow of Christianity. But this is not how Jews themselves understand what they belong to. For the Jews, they remain what they've always been. They're a people, they're a nation, they're the nation of Israel. And it's not until the 19th century and the French Revolution, when Jews can become citizens of France, but that obligation requires them to stop identifying themselves as the nation of Israel, because they have to identify themselves as belonging to the nation of France. And instead, they have to think of themselves as belonging to something called a religion that is called Judaism. And that implicitly is to Christianize them. And the emergence of both Reform Judaism, obviously, I think is pretty obvious, but I think Orthodox Judaism too is basically a process of Christianizing the what previously had been something very, very different. And I think that is a kind of tension in the kind of the multicultural, avowedly secular, avowedly neutral way of kind of integrating different cultures within the West, that generates an implicit tension, because actually it's not neutral at all. It's so rooted in Christian assumptions that it imposes great strains on people like Jews, people like Muslims, who come from very, very different traditions.
And so the tension then is what exactly? Is it that there's a sense that they're being asked to embrace a series of beliefs or values? Is it more subtle than that that are alien to them? What is it?
No, I think it's far more. So after I'd written the book, I watched a 3-part series on Chernobyl, a drama series. I don't know if you saw it. And in that drama, there was a scene where 2 officials are right up close to the reactor as it's leaking radiation, and you can see it because you can see the air ionizing. So you can absolutely see up front what is happening. But of course, the reason that the Chernobyl disaster had the impact that it did is that radioactivity then leaked and spread over Ukraine and Scandinavia and so on. And people breathed it in, but they couldn't see it, and it changed them. And I think that the impact of Christianity has been like that. I don't mean by that it makes your hair fall out or kills you or whatever, but it changes you in ways that you may not even recognize. And I think that how is it impacted, say, on Jews or Muslims? Well, Latin Christendom comes to develop a very, very distinctive way of understanding how society operates. And it's rooted, as everything in Christianity is, in theology. And specifically in this case, in the theology of Augustine, the great church father from Africa in the 5th century, who is trying to explain to a Roman world that still has lots of people who hold to the old ways and the old gods, why Rome has been sacked in 410. And these people say, well, this is proof that we should never have abandoned the old ways of binding ourselves to the gods, religiones in Latin, the sacrifices, the priesthoods, the feast days, that traditionally had been kind of our down payments to the gods who would then look after us. It's a kind of insurance policy. And now we've ripped up that insurance policy. We've moved on to this other god, and look what's happened. Rome has been sacked. Augustine's response to that is to say, actually, no, because Rome has no special role. Rome, like a human life, like a human being, is born to flux. And he uses this word cyculum, which is the span of a human life, to sum up what he means, which is basically that everything, empires like human beings, are born, live, and die. And then they're kind of like leaves born on the great swirl of a river. And the dimension of the cyculum cannot be escaped except through the religio, the bond that the church provides to the radiant eternity of heaven. So he sets up this tension between what over the course of Latin Christian history will come to emerge as the idea of the secular and the idea of religion. And by the 18th century, a lot happens between the time of Augustine and, say, the 17th and 18th centuries. But you say in the English-speaking world, you have a very, very distinctive idea of how society should be organized. There is a space called the secular, where neutral things happen. Finance or markets or whatever. And then you have something called religion. And a religion is simultaneously defined as not being the secular, but it's also something that is personal to you. So England has become a Protestant nation. So the idea that religio establishes a personal bond between every individual believer and God is kind of hardwired again into the language. So religion has by the 18th century has simultaneously come to mean basically, what do you believe? What do you believe about a god? And it's come to mean something that is not the secular. And when the British go out into the world, they take this assumption with them. So most obviously, they go to India, which they call Hindustan, and they call the people of India Hindus. And they say, well, what's the religion of the Hindus? And it's an absolutely mad question, because the Hindus don't have a religion, because religion, that question would have meant nothing to the Christians of the Middle Ages, let alone the Indians of the 18th century. But over the course of the Raj, the fact that English is enshrined as the language of power in British India, lots of Indians come to kind of take on, to internalize this idea that they do belong to a religion, and if they're if they're Hindus, that they belong to something called Hinduism. And when the British leave, India enshrines itself as a secular republic, and that is, even more than cricket, that is the most enduring legacy of British rule. This idea that something called the secular exists, and that you belong to something called a religion, and you can see the strains that has imposed on India in the kind of the rise to power of Narendra Modi and the whole idea of Hindutva. Basically, the idea of Hindutva, the idea that India should be, properly a Hindu nation. The idea behind that is that Hinduism is not a religion that can be parked to one side, rather that it's an entire way of life, that it saturates everything about being Indian. And that's an attempt to get back to a kind of pre-British, English-speaking way of understanding the world. And you see exactly the same process also in the Muslim world, whether it's Erdogan with his attempt to roll back Ataturk secularism, or at its most brutal effect with the Islamic State and its attempt to refound a caliphate that would purge itself of the whole idea of the secular. And I think that one of the reasons why the Islamic State, despite all its horrors, proved so appealing to so many Muslims in Western countries was precisely the fact that Western countries do offer, say, Muslims freedom of religion, but that requires Muslims to see Islam as simply a religion, which it never was. Islam, like whatever you want to call it, was that Hindus were practicing before the British came, was a total way of seeing the world. They never thought of Islam as, they never thought of themselves as belonging to a religion called Islam. It's only with the West that happens.
Was this not true, though, of Christianity itself? John Milbank said, famously, the start of one of his famous works, once there was no secular. That within Christendom, the sense of the secular and the religious, the distinction was really between secular clergy and priests who are in vows, in religious orders. In the Middle
Ages it is, yeah.
Yeah. So that in a sense...
It's Protestantism that changes that. It's the Reformation that changes that. Yeah, absolutely. So you in the introduction you said that even atheism is Christian in the West, and that's because, in a sense, it's a logical endpoint for this, because the secular, which basically gets it gets enshrined in this great revolutionary moment in the 11th century with this kind of succession of very radical popes and reformers who were gathered around the bishopric of Rome that nobody remembers now. And the reason for that is that it was so successful. The revolutions, you remember the ones that don't succeed. The ones that succeed, we just internalize them. And basically these kind of, I think you can call them revolutionaries in the 11th century, they impose this model because they want to enshrine the church as purely virtuous. And they don't want to allow kings and emperors to kind of, say, appoint bishops or to feel that they have a stake in the ordering of the church, because properly the church should be separate from that. And this is so radical, so different to anything that anyone understands anywhere else in Eurasia, that it is a properly revolutionary process. And the long-term impact of that is ironically that it ends up marginalizing the church itself. And what's happened, I guess now, is that the secular has absorbed so much of what the church teaches and taught that it doesn't really need the church anymore. That's the kind of feeling. And
yeah, I mean,
we end up in a situation where the secular has almost come to mean kind of the equivalent of godless.
Right, and the secular is impossible to imagine without Christianity. It's as if Christianity, at least in the ancient world, it seems to eviscerate over time the other gods and leave, as someone else has put it, Christ or nothing. And that in the modern age, you get that alternative seems to be a very stark one, that the secular is the space of values that may once have derived from Christianity but no longer depend on it.
But this is what I mean by the goldfish image. So again, this was one of the words that I ran up against when writing about the Romans. And I'd read about, you read books about the Greeks or the Romans, and there'll be a chapter on religion. So, what religion did the Greeks and the Romans have? The Greeks and Romans didn't have religion. And the idea that you can part religion into a single chapter and then, talk about, I don't know, clothing or women or armies or whatever in other chapters, the divine is everywhere. The sense of the supernatural is everywhere. It's absolutely manifest. And until you get that, you cannot understand these societies. And likewise, I think you can't really understand our society unless you recognize how deeply, deeply culturally contingent the idea of the secular is. It's not neutral. We think it's neutral. It's not neutral. And so inevitably, it imposes vastly greater strains on those from different cultural traditions than it does on Christians. I mean, even for Christians, it's Christians complain about being marginalized. That's exactly what Christians are. Christians are being marginalized. And the irony is that they set in train that process of marginalization.
So let's get back to this, what else Christianity set in train. I mean, you just then were talking about the Gregorian reform, and it's an intriguing part of your book that you make this comparison at one point.
Yes, that's the 11th century one. I didn't mention Gregory, did I? So I should say that.
Gregory, you make a comparison between
emblematic pope.
Yeah, a comparison between Gregory VII, and Luther many centuries later. I mean, one would think of them as polar opposites. But this just points to the radical nature, both of of Luther, of the Gregorian reform, but of course of Christianity itself, which seems to overturn whole ways of being and understanding the world. And again, this is the goldfish phenomenon that you're talking about. I mean, there's so much we take for granted about attitudes towards women and human sexuality, whatever, which we take for granted because of the pervasive influence of Christianity. So let's explore this revolutionary dimension of Christianity. And in relation to perhaps women and human sexuality first, I mean, how did Christianity revolutionize attitudes towards women?
So the image of Christianity today often is very patriarchal. The image of Paul is a kind of finger wagging bigot. He's kind of blue meanie. This idea that the Roman world, the Greek world, was one of blissful hedonism, and then Paul turns up, absolutely pooping the party, spoiling everything, making everyone repressed. The truth is vastly more complex and interesting, as the truth invariably is, I think, and it requires us to understand how deeply Christian as you said, our assumptions are, and because it's an effort to get back into understanding sexuality as the Romans did. And I think it can be difficult for us to comprehend that that there isn't a kind of default understanding of sexuality. There isn't a default way to categorize it. That these two are culturally contingent. So the Roman notions of sexuality were massively structured around the power of a male citizen, basically to do what he liked with his dependents. So for us, the binary, I guess, it revolves around gender, gay, straight, man, woman. For the Romans, the binary was between those who had power and those who didn't. And since the person who had power was always a man, there was a kind of inevitably a slight gender element to it, but not exclusively. So a male householder could sexually use, boys, men, provided they were subordinate to him, exactly as they might use women. And Suetonius, for instance, recognizes that Claudius is distinctive because he only ever slept with women. Galba, another emperor, is distinctive because he only ever slept with men. I mean, these are kind of interesting foibles. It's a bit like today we might say, a man, he has a thing for blondes or brunettes or whatever. But it's not decisive. The really decisive thing is, do you give or do you take? And the right of a householder to take is absolute. He can do what he likes. And in fact, if he doesn't, then he's viewed as somehow deviant and suspicious and effeminate. Paul's understanding of sexuality is completely different. He comes from this Jewish tradition in which the division between male and female is absolute. God creates man and woman separate. That's what Genesis begins with. And so he says, I mean, he basically is suspicious of sexuality, but he recognizes that it's better to marry than to burn. So if you have to have a sexual relationship, it should be one that is modeled on the relationship and the love of Christ for his church. And the man is Christ and the woman is the church. And that to us may sound a little bit sexist. Why shouldn't the woman be Christ? But in the context of a world in which a citizen can do as he likes with his female subordinates, it's of course incredibly radical, because if Paul is writing to, say, a Roman convert or a convert in the Roman city of Corinth, because Corinth had been destroyed by the legions and then refounded as a Roman colony, he's writing to say to a male convert. He's saying to that male convert, you have to behave like Christ, and Christ does not go around sleeping with the scullery maid or sodomizing. I'm not going to use that word. Having anal sex with the page boy. This is unacceptable. You can't do that. Essentially, you have to be monogamous, and that monogamous relationship has to be in a marriage that will last your lifetime. And this is this is an incredibly radical way, incredibly demanding. The Jews accept that a man should the Jews accept that polygamy is acceptable. The Romans accept that divorce is acceptable. Paul closes off both those avenues. He says you can't divorce, and you can only have one husband or wife, because that is what the relationship between Christ and his church is. And over the course of the centuries that follow, a massively radical rewiring of the sexual imagination happens. And it's one in which men are told you have to treat the female body with respect, and women are told you have the right to choose what you will do with your body. And this expresses itself over the course of the Middle Ages as a kind of a really profound social revolution, because the church backed this up by essentially trying to shatter the power of clan lords, who had always seen, in the Roman world, in the early medieval world, into the medieval world, it was taken for granted that a clan lord had the right to tell, you marry her, you cousin marry that cousin, so that we keep things within the clan, we keep things within the broader family. The church says this is unacceptable. If the man and the woman is like Christ and the church, then every man has the right to choose which woman he's going to marry, and vice versa. And so a series of canons are brought in banning incestuous relationships, as the church casts it, up to kind of 7 degrees. So essentially, it becomes impossible to maintain the kind of clans that everywhere else in the world are completely taken for granted. And it basically gives birth to our idea of romantic love, the idea that a marriage should properly be between two people who choose each other and then preserve that love over the course of their lifetimes. And you can see this, the impact that this has, even after the Reformation, in a play written by a man in a very Protestant city, William Shakespeare, when he writes Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet, the Montagues and the Capulets are the clans. Romeo and Juliet are the people who are saying we have the right to love each other, and of course, they get married in a church by the friar, and that kind of Protestant in Protestant England, that understanding survives the Reformation, and it's one that underpins Puritan spirituality. So we have the idea of Puritans as people who have no time for sex whatsoever. That's not the case. Puritans were very keen on sex within marriage. They were not keen on adulterous relationships, because that was obviously counter to Paul's teachings. But they were absolutely into the idea that a man and a woman didn't just have the right, but had a duty to give each other sexual pleasure. And that basically was the ideal that underpinned English-speaking civilization for centuries. And it really only changes in the 60s. And in the 60s, you have this kind of idea, which is really bred of the civil rights movement, that marginalized minorities, people who historically have been oppressed, that there's kind of biblical sanction in the book of Exodus, say, for slaves to cast off their bondage and to come to the promised land. And this is a dynamic that convulses America, that most Christians come to accept in America. If there's no Jew or Greek, then definitely there's no black or white. The kind of moral justice of it is accepted in Christian terms. But in the 60s, you start to get people, say, feminists, gay rights campaigners, who draw on the same kind of idea that we've been historically marginalized, and they don't put it in these terms, but it's basically what they're saying. We have the right to leave Egypt and to go to a promised land. And of course, the reason they don't put it in those terms is because the radical feminism and gay rights are seen by Christians as being antithetical to Christian teaching in a way that the campaigning of the Reverend Martin Luther King had not done. So in the 60s, the idea of love comes to be reconfigured, and with kind of the famous rock stars of the age, the idea of love as physical love, and the idea that all you
Love
need
is
is
all you
love.
need, Hugh. Yeah.
Love is all you need, as the Beatles put it. That love is physical as well as kind of spiritual. And so the idea that Christian teaching is uptight, priggish, something to be jettisoned, is kind of part of the explosive power of the 60s. People say it's Dionysian. Let's get back to this kind of Dionysian world where we could do what we like. But this has consequences, because Dionysus was a rapist. All the Greek gods were rapists. And that right of rapists to do what they want to women, or indeed to young boys, was something that was being jettisoned. Was something that Christianity had kind of fought against over the course of its long existence, and now this
So in
idea is
throwing
kind
off
of being
this Christian approach, they're opening themselves up to something dark.
Yeah. So in the decades since, there's been a kind of massive sexualization of Western culture, and a kind of active repudiation of Christian teachings on self-restraint and monogamy. But this has had consequences, which kind of really exploded to life with the Harvey Weinstein affair. And the Me Too campaign that followed that was basically predicated on the idea that men should show self-restraint. And there were large marches through America, and in other countries as well, particularly when Trump came in, of women demanding that men basically stop groping them, stop hassling them, show continence, respect them. And often in these marches, you would see women dressed up in the red robes and the white headdresses of handmaids from Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale, which had been turned into this TV drama where a kind of Puritan revolution comes in and takes away women's rights. But the paradox was that actually what they were demanding was that men become Puritan again. In other words, that men exercise continence, self-restraint, and respect the right of a woman to control her own body, which was the essence of the Puritan notion of sexual morality. And that seems to me brilliantly to sum up the kind of the complexity of this matrix, the complexity and the ambivalences and the ambiguities of our current relationship to sexual ethics. Because essentially we're in a situation where it's hard, in my lifetime, it's hard to think of a time where male predators are seen as more shocking. I mean, the disapproval for that kind of behavior is pretty much absolute. And yet at the same time, the contempt for Christian sexual morality, on the surface level, equally remains absolute. So the disjunction between the kind of moral commandments that our society is imposing and the contempt for the wellspring of those commandments, I think, is generating all kinds of weird tensions.
Do you think this will be my last question, because unfortunately we're running out of time? But do you think it's possible for a society that has been Christian to abandon Christianity and yet retain the good elements, or does it inevitably give rise to this immense tension that you've just described? On the one hand, seeming to oppose Christian morality while needing aspects of Christian morality in the case of the Me Too movement.
You say good elements. Of course, one's definition of what a good element is,
sure,
invariably will
depend
on Christianity.
Let's say tolerance, forgiveness, love of one's neighbour.
but basically, I mean, the philosopher whose shadow hangs over this whole question is Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche loathed Christianity for everything that we've been talking about. You know, its sense of compassion for the weak. Most famously, Nietzsche wanted to re-enshrine the admiration for the strong and the right of the strong to basically kick sand in the face of the weak. But Nietzsche also saw, you know, much more clearly than most atheists did, that a lot of atheists, a lot of, you know, communists, socialists, whatever, liberals, were basically still Christian in their assumption, and that an age would come when, you know, when these, you know, he says you can't have Christian values without Christian belief, and that once Christian belief goes, then the values will go, and who knows what may follow. Well, we know what followed because we know the history of fascism. I mean, fascism is what followed. And I think that the shock of that experience was such that, in a way, one of the reasons for the kind of the precipitous decline of institutional Christianity since the war is that the Nazis gave us a new mythology by which to understand, you know, conceptualize good and evil. In a sense, we didn't need Jesus anymore. People used to say, "What would Jesus do?" and do it. But now we tend to say, "What would Hitler do?" and do the opposite. And so Hitler has become the devil. The Nazis have become, you know, the evil, the embodiment of evil that has to be resisted and fought against. And Auschwitz has become our image of hell. And it's so powerful that, in a sense, Christianity's values endure through our hatred of Nazism. Because what the Nazis did, unlike, say, the French revolutionaries or the Russian revolutionaries, was to trample not just on institutional Christianity, but on Christianity's core values. The idea that actually the weak do have a kind of moral value that perhaps is greater than that of the strong, and the idea that there is no Jew or Greek. So we, in our society, enshrine the privilege of the unprivileged. And we enshrine the absolute universality of humans because we live in the shadow of what happened when the opposite was enshrined. And we don't need Christianity in a way anymore to do that. But our the hold that we cling to this idea that to lack privilege is to have privilege, and we cling to the idea that there should be, you know, that racism, say, is the ultimate sin. It's still for deeply Christian reasons. It's possible to imagine a different world in which the strong are powerful and in which the world is divided into the civilized and the barbarian, because that was what the ancient world was like, and that's what the Nazis enshrined. It's perfectly possible. The fact that we regard those as abhorrent, I think, is testimony to how deeply Christian we remain.
Tom Holland, Dominion is a wonderful work, and I hope our viewers and readers, listeners, will all go and read it. And it's been wonderful to meet you and to talk to you. And as I said at the start, I hope we see you on our shores sometime soon. Thank you for joining
I
us.
hope so. Thanks so much for having me.